Hi friends! My name is Tiana Despain and I am so excited to be talking about CSS transitions today. I chose this topic because I think it's really interesting to learn about the animation of websites and how to make them more user-friendly and visually appealing. So, it was right up my alley. I'm super excited. Let's start off by talking about what are CSS transitions. Transitions are a way to control what we're changing on an HTML website, specifically the speed and the delays for each of the changes. So the syntax for this is we're going to put transition and then what properties we're changing, the duration or how long we want it to take, the timing function, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then any delays. We can also use initial or inherit to let CSS know that we want to use whatever the parent element is using for their transitions. Next, we want to talk about why we might use CSS transitions. So the biggest thing is animating. The reason we use CSS transitions is to animate something. We can animate the size or color changes. We can use transform, which is actually a property that we can use with transitions. Or if we're using things like hover or on click. I think hover is something where most of us are familiar with at this point. I think we use that in our nav bar a lot to let people know where their mouse is and what they're trying to click. So it's really useful because it's a good indicator to the user what they're doing and why it's important, I guess. It's a good visual cue. The next important thing we need to talk about, which we have to consider with anything we use, I guess, nowadays with CSS, is its compatibility. So thankfully transition is packaged really well and it is pretty acceptable throughout the board on browsers. So this little chart I got from W3 Schools, and it just kind of exemplifies what browsers accept which transitions, which thankfully, like I said, if a browser accepts transition, it also accepts all of its properties. Thank heavens. So let's talk a little bit about how to use transitions. In order to understand how to use a transition in our CSS, we need to understand each of the properties. So there's 4 major properties, like we kind of saw in the syntax of how we write a transition. And each of those are transition, transition delay, transition duration, transition property, transition timing, function. So let's dig deep into each of those and what they mean. I think delay is pretty self-explanatory. So our transition delay is what specifies in seconds or milliseconds the delay of the effect. So like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory. But the syntax will be transition delay and then the time. So we can also, like I said earlier, we can use initial or inherit. And an example is transition delay 1 second. So if you're trying to move like a box from the bottom left-hand side of your screen to the top right-hand side of the screen, and you put the delay for, I don't know, 2 seconds after you hover over it, then, like I said, it'll take 2 seconds. You'll hover, it'll wait 2 seconds, and then go. Next is the transitional duration. So in that same example of moving it from the left bottom to the top right, if we put the duration as 1 second, it's going to move really fast. If we put it as 15 seconds, it's going to move much slower. So it's what specifies, again, in seconds or milliseconds, how long it will take to complete. The syntax is basically the same: transition, duration, time. Again, we can use initial or inherit. And then it's just transition, duration, 3 seconds. Okay, and then with most things, we have to specify what it is we're trying to do. So, transition property. This specifies the name of the CSS property that the transition effect is for. So, in this little example I have here, we're changing the width and the height. So, when the hover happens over this div, the width is going to change to 300 pixels, and the height is going to change to 300 pixels. The syntax for this is transition property. You can either do none, all, list the property, or again, initial or inherent. So an example of why you would use none is if like you want something to move on hover in a small CSS, but when you move to the medium CSS, you no longer want it to move, then you would use none. The next one is one that is really interesting to me. So we're at transition timing duration. Okay, so this specifies the speed curve of the transitional effect. Okay, so that went over my head when I read it. I was like, what? But as I looked at each of these examples, it started to make sense. So the first one is ease. So you can put transition timing duration ease. And this is what the default is, and it specifies that the transition effect will start slow and then get faster and then slow down. So I have an example, so let's look at the example of this. Oops, that's not it. This one is though. Okay, to me it looks really smooth. It's really simple. It just looks natural to me. There it is again. It's moving. I guess that's why it's the default, is because it just looks the most natural, to me at least. The next one is linear, and this is with where it goes with the same speed from the start to end, which you would think this looks really nice, but to me it looks really choppy for some reason. But it is the most consistent. So let's take a look at that one. There it is. And again. So there's that one. And then we have all of these ease options. So we have ease in, ease out, and then like a million more. So I found a website that kind of shows some of the examples, and it shows you how they work. So I'm going to switch over to that. And here it is. So for example, this first one, it's ease in sign. So this little dot on the side is going to show me how fast it's going to move. So it starts out slow and then gets a little bit faster. Okay, and then if we go to like ease out sign, the next one starts faster and then slows down. So I just found this website really interesting. I think I'll use it in the future if I need to animate something more in depth of what speed I want it to go. Anyways. Okay, and then the last one is steps, and this lets you define how many steps you want it to take, and it is like by far the most choppy, but I'm sure there's a reason you would want to use it like that. There's this example also on CodePen. To me, it just looks like it has really bad frame per second or something. There it goes. And the steps for this one was just 4. He chose 4. So maybe I guess if you did a higher frame per not frame per second, if you did a higher step count, then it would look smoother. Just kind of an example of what each of those look like if they're typed out, with each of these divs being a little different. An example of each of these on one screen, like if this was written to run, this is kind of what it might look like. Right here. So again, we have ease, ease in, out, linear, and then some custom ones. So let's watch these roll. I just think that this is so fun to watch. And roll right across the screen. Anyways, it gives you a good idea of what each of them really means. Okay, so I wanted to do some examples of what transitions look like in action in like a full example. So the first one is from an external website, and it just kind of outlines a box. So we've got it's solid, and its height and its width and its background color, and then the transition. And then it clarifies here that on hover, we're going to change the background color, we're going to change the height and the width, and then we're going to transform, which we get to see that property in action, which I think is cool. So here is that one. Here we go. Whoop, there it goes spinning. So I just think that it's really interesting that we can just make that happen with some code. I don't know. So then the second example is from another website, and it is going to change the background color, and I just thought it was interesting how smooth they made the background color change. So let's take a look at that one. So here it is. There it goes. It's red to green. Super simple. But it's one of those things that I think we take advantage of when we see it in websites. Is it actually does take quite a bit to code that. So when I was doing all of this research, I found out that there's a kind of a disagreement on the web on when it's best to use CSS versus JavaScript. Some people think that you should just always use JavaScript. Some people think that CSS animation is great and that it should be the default. But from what I understood, that ideal is a little bit dated, that JavaScript is really useful. So the general consensus I found was that CSS animation is for simple animations. So kind of like the things we just saw, if we're moving a box or we're rotating it, if we want to change a color, then just use CSS. JavaScript should be used more for the complex things. So if we want to make something bounce across the screen, or if we want something to stop or pause or rewind or slow down, then that should be used with JavaScript. Overall, it was really interesting to learn all of these things. I hope that you guys have questions and that you'll reach out to me. And here are some of the sites I used. Sorry about the box. Here we go. And I can link some of the ones I found really interesting in the discussion board. But yeah, reach out to me if you have any questions, and I hope that it's been helpful.